Hello, and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today I want to talk about urban decay, and this is one of the huge problems of cities. And you have these areas where you've got rundown housing, closed factories, lots of pollution, you have vandalized, crumbling buildings, and the question becomes, why does this happen? Okay, so when we talk about urban blight, this urban decay, what is it referring to? The gradual spread of a population to suburban areas, the declining tax base of cities with a high proportion of abandoned buildings, poor social services such as refuse collection, schools, and street repair in some urban centers, all of these or none of these. Well, if you think about what we just talked about, it's all of these things. Urban blight is a combination of this declining tax base, which leads to poor social services, which leads to a gradual spread of a population outside of the city. And so your big indicators of urban decay, and of course the key feature is the deterioration of infrastructure. But some other indicators, the eroding tax base, that's an economic indicator, the loss of social services, the lowered property values, high property taxes. Now that's an interesting thing. I mean, if you look at this is not something that you're going to think of as thinking, wow, that is a lot of money. And of course, someone wouldn't pay a lot of money for it. Having said that, though, remember that idea of land is more expensive as you move towards the city center. Well, where are these things in the city center? So the value of the building is not particularly high, right? But the property taxes, because the land is expensive, the property taxes will be high. You also have a tendency to see economic and ethnic segregation because of some of these other features. So, as people leave the inner city, the municipal area is going to expand into the surrounding areas. And what we're talking about here is urban sprawl. So if you take this city that we have right here, you can see that this is the central business district, right? We'll highlight that. And then over time, people start moving out into areas. It starts out closer, and then they start getting farther and farther and farther away until you just have this sprawl. And sprawl is something we're going to talk about later because it's its own problem, right? Now, when you talk about this process, you start out, you have a neighborhood in the inner city. Affluent people begin to leave. Property values decline, the tax base drops, and they may leave for all kinds of reasons. But the fact is that core, and one of the big reasons, by the way, is to own a home, right? If you're living in the city center, you are probably living in an apartment, and a big pull of suburbs is the opportunity to have a yard and a home and things like that. So people who can afford that will oftentimes leave. Like I said, property values decline, the tax base drops because there's nobody there to pay taxes. The tax rates increase because there's less. You still have all of these things that you have to pay for, the services and the schools, but you don't have the same tax base, and so you're still trying to get all that money if you're the city. But because you can't, those services and schools decline, more people leave, and in this case, it's not a pull factor. That original movement towards the suburbs was a pull factor. Let's own a house. Now it's a push factor. Our neighborhoods are declining. We've got to leave. So businesses are going to close because there's a lack of customers. You're going to start losing jobs. Properties are going to deteriorate further, and the tax base and services are going to be reduced even more. And so you have this sort of never-ending cycle, this spiral downward into decay. All right, so here's just another kind of idea of what are some visual indicators of things that you're going to see in areas that have urban decay. Older housing, a lot of crime, a lot of vandalism. And vandalism is one of those things that you can actually see. You'll see abandoned factories, abandoned homes, lots of traffic congestion. The roads are usually too small as people are driving through the area to get to someplace else. There's a lot of trash everywhere, a lot of pollution. Something you don't see, high prices, right? You will see unemployment, you will see homelessness, because typically if you have people who don't have homes, you're going to see them. If you have people who don't have anything to do in their time, right, they're going to be wandering around a lot of times, and so you're going to see a lot of that. So what is the main reason that buildings deteriorate even though people are still living in them and they're still paying rent? Rent is less than upkeep, landlords are corrupt and don't fix the properties, people don't pay rent and move from one apartment building to the next when they're evicted, fair lease programs don't compensate for building maintenance, and buildings just get old and fall down. Well, most of these things actually do happen, right? Buildings do just get old and fall down if you don't maintain them. Sometimes you do have corrupt landlords who take rent and they don't fix the property, although there are laws in place and you can take action against landlords who do that. That definitely has happened in the past and does still happen today. In some cases, you do have people will move in and they don't pay rent. And this is becoming a little bit more of a problem than it has been in the past. But they don't fully pay their rent, and it takes a couple of months to be evicted. When they're evicted, they'll move someplace else. And then when they're evicted, they'll move someplace else. This isn't a hugely common problem, but it is definitely something that happens. When you have decreased rents, the kind of fair lease programs, which are great because they allow people to have homes, whether it's an apartment or a house, but by the same token, sometimes they don't compensate for the actual upkeep of the building, which brings us to the answer to this question, which is that rent is usually less than the actual upkeep of the building, and that goes back to that declining property value. But you still have this high tax rate, or this high tax rate, and you still have to actually pay for all the things that make a building still nice. All right, so when we talk about the physical problems of the inner city, we're talking about deterioration. A lot of times they were poorly built buildings to begin with, and they don't have any maintenance, so you get leaky roofs, drafty windows, crumbling stonework, leaking within the apartments for plumbing, you have poor electrical work, things like that. Vandalization, right? You get a lot of vandalizing these buildings because there is that idea that if something doesn't look taken care of, or if something isn't taken care of, there's the sense that no one cares about it. And so why do anything? And so there is a connection between the appearance of a building and the rate at which it's vandalized. And there's a very famous case study, and that's of New York City. When Rudy Giuliani became mayor, he had people go in and clean all of the graffiti off of the subways, and crime and vandalism went down, right? And it's an interesting thing. It's that idea that this is nice, someone's taking care of it, someone's watching it, and it leads to a psychology that decreases those kinds of behaviors. The other thing that you get in this deterioration are gap sites, and so you'll just have empty lots. It's called derelict land, and that's where buildings have been torn down. So back to that rent being less than upkeep, this is actually called filtering, and so you have not enough money to maintain the property. And then slum housing is also something that will start to show up, and slum housing is something we'll talk about more when we talk about developing nations. But in slum housing, you have derelict buildings, or you have kind of the shanty town where people just build stuff with whatever materials are available. And so here you're having poor sanitation, you're having overcrowding, you have no services, electricity, water, no heating, and so it's a real problem. Now, this leads to social problems. You have a reinforcement of the underclass in that area, and that leads to a culture of poverty. So when you have a lack of job skills because you have poor schools, you have not enough training or jobs available, there's a lot of homelessness, you have crime, right? And so you have people who are desperate to make money. So homelessness and lack of job skills, crime, and then also you will see a lot of ethnic and racial segregation in these neighborhoods. All right, so which of the following would probably not cause additional environmental problems in inner cities? We talked about physical, we've talked a little bit about social, we'll talk about those more in a second. But what about environmental problems? Failing water and sewer systems, inconsistent trash collection, clusters of aging factories, abandoned parking lots, or all of these would cause environmental problems? Actually, out of these, the least damaging and possibly one that could be helpful is the abandoned parking lot. It sounds bad, abandoned parking lots, but if you think about it, the abandoned parking lots are not maintained. They actually start to break apart, which allows for water to infiltrate into the ground. They don't have cars actively on them, so there's not a lot of oil and tire debris and things like that. And so abandoned parking lots sound really bad, but they're actually not environmentally. Now, they have some other issues that goes to that derelict lots kind of situation. But failing water and sewer systems, inconsistent trash collections, and clusters of aging factories, those are all real problems, right? The factories and the housing being in the same area, that's a pollution issue, right? Those factories are usually older. They're usually not well maintained, and so people who live in the houses near those factories are subject to air, noise, and water pollution. The deterioration of the infrastructure means that you have possible water contamination issues, you have sewage issues, and so water pollution and lack of service are issues with that. Trash debris and collection in derelict areas is usually not great. And so trash and debris will actually collect in derelict areas. And you can see you've got this overflowing from inconsistent pickup or minimal pickup. And that, of course, brings disease. Garbage attracts vermin. Vermin will live in rundown buildings because they have easy access and they can make little nests. And then just overcrowding in those areas. And so urban blight and urban decay might look something very much like this picture. So we've got the rundown housing, right? We've got the vandalism, we've got the broken windows, all of that, right? And broken windows are actually a big deal. Several studies have shown that just broken windows invite vandalism, right? Graffiti, of course, brings more graffiti. And then we're looking at apartment buildings and factories and stuff, but a lot of inner city areas do have houses. And when those are abandoned, those will often become what we call feral houses. And here are two feral buildings. This one you can't even see anymore because it's so overgrown. This is kudzu. It's an invasive species. It will cover houses. You've got some kudzu here too, especially in the south. This is a huge problem. But you have these houses. These are unsafe. If anyone tried to stay in here, they could actually get seriously hurt. All right, and then of course the factory buildings that we've been talking about, again with the broken windows, right? You've got plants growing out of cracks in the wall. This makes the walls unstable. It makes the bricks crumble, and not just the facade. It can actually be a problem for the whole building itself. It causes instability. And then of course you've got your graffiti issues, right? Boarded up windows are better than broken windows in terms of appearance, but not by much. Okay, so all of this comes together to create a social issue called the spatial mismatch principle. And what that means ultimately is this: the skills of many inner city residents don't actually match the inner city job opportunities. Okay, job opportunities are usually better in suburbs. Costs to commute to these jobs are high compared to the salaries, right? It's called reverse commuting, by the way, when you commute from the inner city to suburbs, it's reverse commuting. But a lot of times, so you have people who might be able to get jobs in suburbs, okay? But many times, because you have poorer schools and a lack of job training in the inner city, you don't have really skilled employees. Okay, skilled jobs get more income. So you're having low skilled or unskilled jobs, but those jobs being far away are too expensive to get to. Your salary doesn't cover the actual cost to get to the job. And so people end up just isolated where they are without jobs. Okay, and that's the real issue with the unemployment situation. And it's really major cities that have been affected by urban decay in areas that are industrial. So the big major U.S. cities affected by urban decay are Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Chicago, St. Louis, Philadelphia, and then some others that have been devastated, right, by various changes in the economy, governmental policies, local governmental policies or state governmental policies, are Flint, Michigan, which just recently had that big water issue, Camden, New Jersey, Canton and Dayton, Ohio, and Scranton, Pennsylvania. And when you look at vanishing cities, again, it's the same thing. All of these cities are on the list. These populations are declining. Okay, and when we map those cities that I just listed to you, they are in an area called the Rust Belt. And as we know, and they're actually trying to stop people from calling it the Rust Belt, so I'm only going to say it that one time, although it is on your vernacular regions quiz, because people are trying to really revitalize these areas. But the steel industry, iron industry, and the automotive industries, when those collapsed, this whole area collapsed. And it was a really big economic disaster for these areas. Okay, so why did this happen? Well, part of it has to do with relocation of manufacturing to places like the Sun Belt, Mexico, and overseas, right? In some people, will attribute some of that to unions. Some people attribute it to government regulations. Some people attribute it to cheaper labor elsewhere, to more access to supplies, to more economical shipping in other places. There are lots of reasons and lots of hypotheses, but ultimately transportation costs have dropped over the course of the 20th century, and so that means that you don't necessarily have to be close to water. You can start doing a lot of truck transport. That trucking transport is actually cheaper than it used to be, and so you don't have to have factories and things that are situated on bodies of water necessarily. Okay, and also large corporations start buying places and consolidating factories, and that's a big issue. Okay, Pittsburgh, for instance, has lost 75,000 people, actually more than 75,000 people since the 2000 census. And part of that is because sometimes people just want to live where it's warmer. Interestingly enough, that goes to a geographical reason. And also, some people have just lost their jobs because of technological advances. In some cases, robots have taken over people's jobs. Right? Or there are more efficient ways to do it. And we talked about this when we talked about agriculture. Farms used to employ lots more people than they do now, partly because there is that idea that it is a meager profit, but also because you have these really technologically advanced machines that do the jobs people used to do. Now, having said that, though, there's some positive outlooks, right? So a lot of these places are trying to adapt to non-manufacturing industries. Pittsburgh, for instance, is really trying to recover because it's looking into other areas of business. It's trying to become a center of research and development, also for finance, and we'll talk about this more a little bit later on in class. There's also urban renewal and gentrification, and I want to talk about those two things because they have some huge positives, but they also have some huge negatives. All right, so what's urban renewal? This is an effort from within the city. Usually it's the municipal government has an area within the city and says, you know what, we need locally to do something about this. So a lot of times that'll involve replacing tenements and projects with high-rise flats, renovating existing houses through various programs, which could include a lot of community service programs like People Helping People and Habitat for Humanity, encouraging new businesses and industry to set up in the area. And we've actually been doing a really good job of that here in Dallas. Farmers Branch, for instance, is a really great example. They've made lots of offers to several businesses to come in and build factories or stores or office complexes within the area, and they also built a bunch of kind of more trendy apartments off of the rail line, right, to help get younger couples to come in. That's part of urban renewal. And then also landscaping. Landscaping turns out to be a big deal because it goes back to that idea of appearance, right? When you have something that is well tended, people will want to spend time there. They might want to live there. If you have something that looks run down and dilapidated, then people are not really interested in that. The other thing that you have to do is build and improve social facilities, which includes schools, right? Schools. Good schools are a huge draw. And that is one of the things that inner cities are usually lacking. All right, so here is a house that is abandoned. Clearly, it is not something that is suitable to live in. Okay. Here you have buildings that are falling down right here on the right. So what would urban renewal look like? Well, you would have this nice, shiny, fancy building, or you would have a nice housing complex or a nice business. These are little townhouses, right? So you might even tear this house down and then say, okay, but I can fit 4 families here, right? That's really what we're looking at in urban renewal. The other thing that we see is something called urban consolidation, and Vancouver did a really good job of this too, actually. They're kind of the model for North America. What that means is that you consolidate homes and businesses into multi-income apartment complexes that have schools and facilities in the lower floors. And so you could live in an upper floor, the grocery store, your kids' schools, if you have children, your job, all kinds of things would be within this complex. And then you surround it with beautiful green spaces. It works really well too, especially if you're on a waterway. And so lots of places, Portland, Oregon did this, Vancouver's done it, lots of cities have done it. Some of the suburb in Sydney has done that. This is actually pictures of the suburb in Sydney. Now, the other thing that you see is urban gentrification. And urban gentrification is where you have these people that are called urban pioneers. They're usually young, suburban, middle class couples. They move to working low income areas. It doesn't have to be couples, actually. It's anybody. So they move to working low income areas, and then they fix up buildings. So here you have urban decay. Here you have a building that somebody's come in and bought and fixed up. And so what you see is this renewal and investments in restaurants, bars, commercial businesses, little shops, right, and these apartments. And so you have this revival of this area, and it becomes like hip, and it attracts more people. Usually those more people are of upper socioeconomic status. They move to the area, right, and then you start having these changes. So why do urban pioneers move to the inner city to begin with? It's cool and trendy, there are cuter houses there, they have lower rent, it's easier to buy property, or there are more green roofs. Well, it is cool and trendy because they make it cool and trendy, and there are cute houses sometimes, but the bottom line is it's about lower rent. You can move into an area, you can pay very little money for it, you can fix it up, and then hopefully, right, the area it undergoes that urban renewal that we were just talking about. Also, a lot of people are moving because they're moving to be closer to their workplace. They're actually working downtown in the financial district. We have less of that here in Dallas because we don't really have an actual like financial district downtown, but lots of places do. So you've got this low rent, you're close to work, you could even walk there. Now here are the problems. Urban gentrification has some real problems. You have this low rent, that's great. But over time, fixing all of these buildings up and starting to charge these upper middle class families that are moving in, you see an increase in rent, and you see an increase in the price of goods, things like groceries, gasoline, that stuff. And so there becomes this conflict of the people who are moving in with the original residents in the area, who end up usually being forced to leave because they can't afford it anymore. It really prices out the local residents. So gentrification it helps the area, but it doesn't actually help the people who were living in the area before. And so the idea is that you have to figure out some way to renew these areas without simply just moving the people who lived there before out, right? And so that involves a really complicated system of things that people have to do. And some other things that you see that help contribute, hopefully, to revitalizing areas are green belts, right? So you force urban sprawl to stay within specific areas and you don't just pave over everything. That you organize street patterns. And when you're building neighborhoods, you build around cul-de-sacs and loops as opposed to traditional grid design because it builds more of a sense of community. You have planned communities, and within those planned communities, you can have multiple levels of price ranges for those different types of housing. You have zoning laws, right? Zoning laws will... In a lot of cases, you have residential areas and you have commercial areas, but in order to do urban consolidation, you have to kind of combine those. And then also, you have to build in places where people can come and be a community together, not at work, right? Not at school, and in playtimes. And they're usually, it's called festival settings, but basically you just have large recreational areas for people to go and hang out, right? Relax. And then also office parks, right? You need zones of urban land that are specifically set aside for corporate offices, and then you need to include incentives for businesses to locate their offices to those office parks. And if those office parks are close to these new revitalized neighborhoods, then you can have a variety of jobs, unskilled to skilled, and so you could have a variety of economic levels that live within those areas, and that's a really important thing. Okay, so urban decay is an issue in the developed world where people are trapped in urban centers with no opportunity for change. In the developed world where people are leaving older cities for better opportunities in newer cities. In the developing world where fringe cities are built by squatters and not supported by existing infrastructure. In the developing world where people are forced into makeshift cities by the wealthy elite. Actually, two answers to this, and it's B and C. We see urban decay in all over the world, right? In the developed world, typically you have people leaving older cities for better opportunities where jobs have moved, which is usually in newer cities, so that's B. But it's what we've been talking about. But in the developing world, you have all these fringe cities that are built by people who can't afford homes, who don't have jobs, right? Things like that. And those areas are not supported by the existing infrastructure. Okay, so the answers are B and C, not A, that is false, and not D, that is also false. Okay, so urban decay in developing countries. What we're talking about here are slum communities, and we're going to spend some more time talking about this in class. But a slum is defined by having no utilities, nobody who lives there owns the land. Crime and disease are endemic to these areas. It's a huge problem. Unfortunately, they are expected to grow into the middle of the century, and they're usually they're usually populated by rural immigrants, and that's going to continue to be an issue as we start having this, or as we continue rather, to have this shift from agriculture to rural. I mean, remember when we were talking about agriculture, we're talking about people moving into the cities, okay? And so what do they need? They need home security, they need more jobs, they need cheap transportation, and ultimately they need government representation. Most of the time, the slum areas are not represented by anyone, so there's no one looking out for their interests. And in many cases, the land is owned by the government, or it's owned by the government, or it's not really owned by anyone, I guess. But the government will actually go in and clear people out. They'll bulldoze people's homes, and then those people have no place to go. So you have all of these people who are in serious need, and because of that, they are in fact the most vulnerable when catastrophe happens, right? Fires, as you see in this picture right here, right? Fires run rampant through them because the buildings are not sound, right? They're fire traps. Anytime there's an earthquake, right, like up here, or a landslide, these buildings are not stable. I mean, they're not actual buildings. They're just constructed together with makeshift stuff, right? And so all over the world, you have these people who are living. We have a situation of urban decay and decline, and those neighborhoods are suffering and they are in need, but they are much more stable than the same areas in developing nations. The quality of life here is so amazingly low. And if you think about how quality of life is affected by urban decay in places like the United States, you can only imagine what it would be like in places like Kuala Lumpur. Okay, so that is it for urban decay. We're going to spend 2 days on this. We're going to talk about urban decay in cities in the north in the United States, and we're going to talk about slums around the world on the second day. All right, if you have any questions, please ask in class, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.